The day Genevieve Ashworth decided to laugh at a man in a paint-stained jacket was the day she stopped being the smartest person in the room. She just didn't know it yet. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of gray, damp morning that settles over Vancouver like a wet wool blanket and refuses to lift. The Meridian Innovation Summit had taken over the entire fourth floor of the Fairmont Pacific Rim, and Genevieve had arrived 40 minutes early, the way she always did. Heels clicking on marble, coffee in hand, the faint smell of her leather portfolio mixing with the hotel's ambient cedar scent. She was 38 years old, the CEO of Ashworth Materials, a company she had built from a licensing agreement and a line of credit into one of the most talked-about advanced textiles firms in Western Canada. She had been on the cover of BC Business twice. She had been quoted in the Globe and Mail more times than she could count. She did not suffer fools. She did not have time to. The summit was invitation only. 40 executives, 12 venture partners, and a handful of what the organizers diplomatically called emerging innovators. These were the wild cards, the founders who had applied through an open submission process, the ones who hadn't necessarily gone to Souder or Rotman or Queens, who didn't have the right last names or the right zip codes, but who had apparently built something the selection committee found interesting enough to include. Genevieve had served on that committee 2 years ago. She remembered voting against most of them. The morning keynote went smoothly. There was a panel on supply chain resilience that she found moderately useful, a coffee break where she caught up with 2 board members she'd been meaning to call, and then a networking session that preceded the afternoon pitches. It was during this session, 30 executives circling the room like well-dressed sharks, exchanging cards and calibrated smiles, that she first noticed him. He was standing near the far window, looking out at the harbor. He was holding a coffee cup with both hands the way people do when they're slightly cold and slightly nervous, and he was wearing a dark navy sport coat that might have been fine once, but had a faint streak of something pale across the left lapel, paint or plaster or some kind of resin. His name tag said Owen Cafferty, Cafferty Workshop, Halifax, Halifax. Genevieve clocked that in about 2 seconds. She was from Halifax originally, and she had left at the moment she had the means to. She knew exactly what kind of operation ran out of Halifax with a name like Cafferty Workshop. She pictured a garage. She pictured a man who was very good at building things with his hands and very bad at understanding why that alone was not enough. She didn't approach him. There were better conversations to be had. But then Marcus Lung, a venture partner from a firm she respected, made his way across the room to the window, and the two of them shook hands, and Marcus laughed at something Owen said. Not a polite laugh, a genuine one. And Genevieve thought, well, that's unexpected. She filed it away. She moved on. The afternoon pitches were scheduled in a long, narrow conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows along one side and a projection screen at the front. The emerging innovators each had 10 minutes. Most of them were fine. One was genuinely impressive, a woman from Waterloo with a battery recycling process that made Genevieve lean forward in her chair. One was catastrophically underprepared, fumbling through slides that clearly hadn't been designed for the room. Owen Cafferty was last. He walked to the front of the room carrying what appeared to be a small wooden crate, the kind you might find at a farmer's market. He set it on the table beside the podium. He did not click to a slide. He did not open his laptop. He just stood there for a moment, and Genevieve noticed that the paint streak on his lapel was even more visible under the conference room lighting. "I'm going to start," he said, "by showing you something." His voice was quiet, not nervous quiet, measured quiet, the voice of someone who had learned, probably through hard experience, not to rush. He reached into the crate and pulled out a piece of fabric. It was roughly the size of a hand towel, and it was completely unremarkable, off-white, slightly textured, the kind of thing you might find in any linen closet in the country. He held it up. Someone near Genevieve shifted in their seat. She heard, just barely, a soft exhale that was almost a laugh. She looked at the man beside her, Douglas Firth, a real estate developer turned angel investor who had the attention span of a golden retriever and twice the confidence. He was smiling with one side of his mouth, the kind of smile that said, "This is what I drove downtown for." Owen set the fabric down on the table. He picked up a small blowtorch, the compact kind used for culinary work, and he lit it. The flame was blue and precise, and then without theatrics, without any particular showmanship, he pressed the flame directly to the fabric. The room went still. The fabric did not burn. It didn't char. It didn't melt. It sat there under direct flame for 5 full seconds. Genevieve counted, and when Owen pulled the torch away and held the fabric up again, there was no mark on it, no scorching, no smell. The silence lasted about 3 seconds before someone said, "What?" and someone else said, "Is that?" And then Douglas Firth, who had been smiling with one side of his mouth, sat up straight in his chair. Genevieve said nothing. She was already thinking. But she hadn't been thinking that 40 minutes earlier. That part mattered, and she knew it, because later, weeks later, in quieter moments, she would return to that 40 minutes the way you return to a stone in your shoe that you should have stopped to remove. During the coffee break before the pitches, she had been standing with two other executives near the registration table when Owen walked past carrying his wooden crate. He had stopped at the table to check in with the coordinator, and the crate had bumped against the edge of the table, and something inside it shifted with a dull clunk. The coordinator, a young woman named Blythe, who was professionally unflappable, had looked up and smiled. "Mr. Cafferty? You're all set. Do you need a hand with that?" "I've got it, thanks," Owen said. "What's in the box?" Douglas Firth had asked from somewhere behind Genevieve's left shoulder. He'd said it the way people say things when they don't actually expect an interesting answer. Owen had turned. "Material samples." "A few tools. You're one of the workshop guys?" Douglas said. Not unkindly, exactly, but not kindly either. "Cafferty Workshop, yeah." Douglas had looked at Genevieve with an expression she recognized, the quick, sideways look that powerful people exchange when they want confirmation that they're seeing what they think they're seeing. She had looked back at him and she had done something she was not proud of. She had smiled, not a big smile, just enough. Just a slight upward tilt at the corner of her mouth that said, "Yes, I see it too. Yes, I know." Owen had seen it. She was almost certain he had seen it. He hadn't said anything. He'd just picked up his crate and walked toward the conference room. After the pitch, the room stayed charged. Owen instructions for 20 minutes. Technical questions that he handled with the quiet precision of someone who had answered them many times in private before he ever had to answer them in public. He explained the composition without revealing the proprietary details. He explained the applications: protective workwear, emergency response gear, aerospace insulation, marine equipment. He talked about the 3 years of iteration, the failed grant applications, the small business loan he'd taken against his house in Dartmouth. "Against your house?" someone said. "Against my house," Owen confirmed. There was no drama in the way he said it, just fact. Marcus Lung asked about production capacity. Owen answered. A woman from a Calgary Impact Fund asked about environmental certifications. Owen had them. Douglas Firth, who had reorganized himself into a posture of intense interest, asked about the patent status. 3 patents issued, Owen said. 2 pending. The core process has been registered in Canada, the US, and the EU. Douglas wrote something down. Genevieve had not written anything down yet. She was watching Owen's hands when he spoke. They were the hands of someone who made things, broad across the palm, with small scars at the knuckles. And she was thinking about what it cost to spend 3 years in a workshop in Dartmouth, alone with a problem, betting your house on it, before walking into a room like this. She was also thinking about the smile she had exchanged with Douglas Firth 40 minutes ago. The summit ended at 5 o'clock. There was a reception afterward. Wine, charcuterie, the usual choreography of deal-making disguised as socializing. Genevieve got a glass of something white and cold and stood near the windows where the city was beginning to light up in the gray afternoon dusk. Owen was across the room talking to Marcus again. She watched him for a moment. He'd left the wooden crate somewhere, presumably with the hotel staff, and without the context of the pitch, he just looked like a man at a party where he didn't quite know the dress code. The paint streak was still on his lapel. He had his hands in his pockets. She walked over. "Mr. Cafferty." He turned. His eyes were a specific shade of brown that reminded her of creek water, clear and slightly dark at the same time. He was maybe 40, maybe 42. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting, probably, from years of close work. Miss Ashworth," he said. He said it without any particular edge, just her name. "Your presentation was remarkable." "Thank you," she waited. Most people, when she said something like that, filled the space immediately with gratitude, with pitch, with the nervous energy of wanting to make a good impression on her. Owen didn't fill the space. He just waited, the same way she was waiting. She almost smiled. "How long have you been working on the thermal resistance process?" "The core idea came about 9 years ago," he said. "I spent the first 5 years thinking I was wrong. The last 4 figuring out that I wasn't." "What made you sure?" He looked at her for a moment, not long, just a beat. The fabric didn't burn. She requested a follow-up meeting before she left the reception. Her assistant sent the calendar invite that evening. The meeting was set for 2 weeks out, at Ashworth Materials' office in Yaletown. In the intervening 2 weeks, Genevieve did what she always did when something caught her attention. She researched until she couldn't sleep. She found Owen Cafferty's 3 issued patents and read each one. She found a brief mention of Cafferty Workshop in a Nova Scotia small business profile from 4 years ago. 2 employees specializing in custom fabrication and material testing. She found a short piece in an Atlantic trade publication about an unnamed Halifax workshop that had quietly been supplying prototype material to a national first responder organization for field testing. She called a contact at that organization. She didn't identify why she was asking. She just asked whether the material had performed. "I can't comment officially," her contact said. "But off the record, our field teams asked if they could keep the samples." She set the phone down. She looked out her office window at the water. The leaves were coming down now, November in Vancouver, gold and brown against gray sky, and she thought about a man in a workshop in Dartmouth who had spent 9 years being right before anyone believed him. Owen arrived at the Yaletown office on a Wednesday morning. He wore a different jacket this time, dark wool, no paint, and he carried a briefcase that looked like it had been borrowed or recently purchased, the hinges still stiff. Her assistant brought them coffee. The room they used was the small boardroom, just the two of them. He had brought more samples, better samples. He laid them on the table in order, smallest to largest, thinnest to thickest, with a methodical care that made Genevieve think of surgeons or geologists, people for whom the arrangement of objects was itself a form of language. She picked up the lightest one. It had a texture she hadn't expected, faintly soft, almost like linen, nothing like what you'd imagine from something that could resist a torch flame. "It's lighter than I expected," she said. "That's the thing about it," Owen said. "Most thermal-resistant materials are heavy. They're protective because they're dense. This is protective because of the structure." She turned the sample over in her hands. "How did you arrive at the structure?" "Trial and error, mostly error." A brief pause. "And my daughter." She looked up. "Your daughter? She was 8 when I started this. She used to sit on a stool in the workshop and watch me work. One afternoon she picked up a failed sample, one that had curled in a particular way after testing, and she held it up and said it looked like a waffle. Like the pattern in a waffle iron." He paused. She wasn't wrong. The failure pattern pointed to something. "I'd been looking at it as a problem for 2 years. She looked at it for 30 seconds. Genevieve was quiet for a moment. "How old is she now?" 17. "Does she know she contributed to 3 patents?" "She does," he said. And something crossed his face briefly. Not quite a smile, something quieter than a smile. "She's thinking about materials engineering at Dal." They talked for 3 hours. At some point, Genevieve's assistant knocked to remind her of a 2 o'clock call, and she waved it off, which was something she almost never did. By the time the light through the boardroom windows had shifted from morning white to afternoon gold, they had covered the production process, the cost modeling, the supply chain requirements, the regulatory pathway, the competitive landscape, and what a formal partnership between Cafferty Workshop and Ashworth Materials might actually look like. It would look as best as they could sketch it out that afternoon, like this. Ashworth Materials would license the process, handle the scale-up, and take the product to the industrial markets it was already embedded in. Owen would retain full creative control over process development. The royalty structure would be weighted toward him, more heavily than Genevieve's CFO was going to like. But she had already decided that was the right call, and she had learned, over 15 years of running a company, to trust those decisions when they arrived fully formed. "I'll have our legal team draw up a preliminary term sheet," she said, when they finally sat back from the table. Owen nodded. He was looking at the samples he'd spread out over the boardroom table, looking at them the way you look at something that is about to change, that is on the edge of becoming something other than what it's been. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes, at the summit, before the pitches." He looked at her. "You smiled at that fellow, Firth, when I walked past with the crate. You know that, right?" Genevieve didn't look away. She had known this was coming, or something like it. She had known it since the reception. "I know," she said. "I'm not looking for an apology," Owen said. "I've been in enough rooms to know how it works. I want to know if you see it, the thing that made you do that." She looked at him for a long moment. Through the window behind him, a container ship was making its slow way across the inlet, enormous and patient. "I see it," she said. "I've been seeing it more clearly the last 2 weeks." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right then, that was all." He picked up his briefcase, the stiff-hinged one that was probably borrowed, and they shook hands, and her assistant showed him out. And Genevieve stood alone in the boardroom for a few minutes, looking at the samples laid out across the table, like a map of something that had taken 9 years to make. The term sheet went to Owen's lawyer, a woman in Halifax, who Genevieve learned later had been Owen's neighbor growing up and had done the legal work at a reduced rate because she believed in him on the 14th of November. By the end of the month, it had gone through 2 rounds of revisions. Owen's asks were modest, focused entirely on process integrity and creative rights, not on money in the way Genevieve had expected. He wanted assurance that the material wouldn't be rushed to market before it was ready. He wanted a clause that gave him right of review over any modifications to the core process. He wanted it in writing that his daughter's contribution, the observation about the waffle pattern, would be acknowledged in any public account of the product's development. That last one had not come from his lawyer. It had come from him directly in an email at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, written in the plain, careful prose of someone who chose words the way he chose materials. For durability. I know it's a small thing contractually, he wrote, but she was 8 and she saw what I couldn't see. I'd like that on record somewhere that isn't just my workshop notes. Genevieve read the email twice. Then she forwarded it to her legal team with a note that said, "Include this. No discussion needed." The product launched publicly the following September, not quite a year after the summit. Ashworth Materials held the launch event in Halifax, which had been Owen's preference and which Genevieve had agreed to without hesitation. Partly because it was the right thing to do, and partly because she had something unfinished there, something personal that had nothing to do with Owen and everything to do with the version of herself she'd been before she'd learned to look at a man carrying a wooden crate and smile. The launch was held at the Discovery Center, which Owen had chosen because his daughter had been going there since she was small. About 200 people came, industry contacts, first responders, press, local officials, people from Owen Street, people who had known him when the workshop was losing money and the loan was keeping him up at night. His daughter, Elsa, stood near the back in a green sweater and watched everything with the careful attention of someone already thinking about how it worked. Genevieve gave remarks. She talked about the material. She talked about what it could do, the applications in emergency response, in industrial workwear, in aerospace. She talked about what it meant to build something from the ground up, in the face of skepticism, without the infrastructure that made it easier to be taken seriously. She did not editorialize. She did not confess anything publicly. That wasn't the place for it. But she did say this. The most important thing Cafferty Workshop taught me, is that materials have a story before they have a market. The story usually starts in a place nobody's watching. A workshop, a garage, a kitchen table. Someone with a problem they can't leave alone, and not enough money to give up, and not enough sense to stop. Those are the places where the real work happens, and too often we arrive after the work is done, with our term sheets and our networks and our $100 networking events, and we tell ourselves we discovered something. We didn't discover it. We just finally showed up. Owen was standing off to one side. He was looking at the floor when she said it, the way people do when they don't want to be seen receiving something. Afterward, Elsa found her way through the crowd to Genevieve. "I'm Elsa Cafferty," she said. She was tall and direct-eyed, with her father's measured quality of waiting before she spoke. "I know who you are," Genevieve said. "You're the one who saw the waffle." Elsa almost laughed. "Almost, that's what Dad calls it. It's in the contract," Genevieve said. "Your observation, it's acknowledged." Elsa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know that. He asked us to include it." Something moved in Elsa's face, something that was too complicated to name, the expression of a 17-year-old who was recalibrating something quietly, in real time. "He didn't tell me," she said. "He probably thought it would be more embarrassing than it was," Genevieve said. "Yeah," Elsa said, and she looked across the room to where her father was talking to a group of first responders, his hands moving the way they did when he was explaining something, open and deliberate. That's pretty much him. Douglas Firth came to the launch. He had been one of the first people to reach out after the summit, once the patent information circulated and the field test results became public. He had sent an email that was professionally warm, in a way that said he understood he had missed something. Genevieve had replied briefly and professionally. She had not ignored him. At the launch, he found her near the catering table and said, with the self-awareness of a man who had been practicing, "I should have asked more questions at the summit." "Yes," Genevieve said. He waited for her to say something else. She didn't. He nodded slowly, the way people do when they understand that a conversation has just taught them something, and the thing it taught them is that they don't get to feel better about it today. Then he excused himself, and she let him go. On the flight back to Vancouver, a direct red-eye, the kind of flight that blurs the line between late night and early morning, until the coast appears below you in darkness punctuated by lights. Genevieve opened her laptop and found herself looking at the photo the communications team had sent her. Owen and Elsa, standing in front of the product display, not posed, just caught mid-sentence, both of them looking at the same point in the middle distance. He was a full head taller than her. She had his posture. Genevieve looked at the photo for a while. She thought about 9 years in a workshop in Dartmouth. She thought about a loan against a house. She thought about an 8-year-old on a stool saying it looks like a waffle, and a man who had spent 2 years looking at a failed sample and could not see what his daughter saw in 30 seconds. She thought about how many other wooden crates she had walked past. She closed the laptop. Below, the plane crossed into the dark water between provinces, somewhere over nothing in particular, and she sat with that thought the way you sit with something that doesn't get lighter the longer you carry it. It just becomes more yours. The coast came up through the clouds eventually. The lights of Vancouver spread below her, enormous and indifferent, and the plane began its long descent, and Genevieve Ashworth, who had been on the cover of BC Business twice and had never once been wrong about a material, looked out the small oval window and thought, well, now you know.